God. All right. Stage is yours.
Wonderful. Good morning. Good morning. It's so great to be here with you. Well, I don't know. I was closing my eyes for the exercise you were walking us through. I'm like, oh man, I am ready for the football game. Are you? All right. So Martech. Boy, what a strange thing Martech is. There's a fellow named Tom Fishburne who does these cartoons about marketing and Martech. And I always like this one of his where, there's this meeting and people are saying, we found that our marketing is ineffective and annoying to our potential customers. And then the Martech person is like, hey, with the right software, we could annoy them more efficiently. So, no, of course, we're here to delight, engage, win over our customers. And the technologies that we have at our disposal to do that are, well, I think you used the word infinite, and it sure does feel that way. As I've been studying marketing technology for almost a couple decades at this point, in 2011, I did this map of about 150 different marketing technologies. And at the time, that seemed crazy, 150. How would you ever keep track of them all? And then year over year, this landscape kept growing. It was growing exponentially for a while. I know it's not really readable here. You want me to zoom in? Okay, that's better, right? No, actually, if you're going to read this, you really do need some sort of professional equipment. In fact, it doesn't even make sense to look at it that way. We at this point, we have to sort of just go back to the numbers of it. And this growth of marketing technology, I think one of the things that I find useful about this number is we all know that marketing has been changing tremendously over this past decade. You feel it. Those of you running businesses who have clients that you're advising on this, they feel it. But it's kind of hard to actually quantify just how much it's changed. And I would humbly propose, as we talk through this today, that this growth in the marketing technology landscape is a very real artifact. It's a very real shadow of just how significant the growth and change has been. And we can quantify this. So over, 13 years, 9,304%. So when someone asks you just how much marketing has changed, in the past decade, you're like, oh, about 9,000%. No, really, I've got the numbers. All right. As we start to go down this journey of how we make sense of this, how do we make this easier for us, it's worth noting that crazy landscape with all those tiny little logos is not really representative of this industry. Because all those different logos, they're very different sizes. They have very different market share. And if you were to line them up, based on their scale and their presence within their category, you would get something that looks like what they call a long tail distribution. There's a number of companies that are sort of in the head and the torso. Major solutions like Ibexa that, are very widely known. They're these platforms. Then you have this long tail of many, many, many other specialist-type products. And that long tail is not, it's not all the same thing. There are many different kinds of companies operating that long tail. Some of them that are startups that aspire to disrupt the head and the torso. Some of them are specialists in particular regions or particular vertical markets. Increasingly, we're seeing software companies that are built around platforms like Ibexa, these ecosystem products. Services companies, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this, services companies are increasingly also packaging up their own secret sauce into standalone products. So there's this very wide range, and many different companies in that long tail of aspirations for how they want to grow. Now, this is looking at it from the supply side, and the supply of Martech is wide and large. What about the demand side? And this is interesting too. So there's a company called Xylo that's a SaaS management platform. So they plug into your finance systems and they help you keep track of all the different SaaS products you have. And as a result, they're able to publish data of really the empirical insights into just how many SaaS products companies use. And it's a lot. This is their most recent numbers they just published a couple weeks ago, and for even small companies like 500 or fewer employees, the average was around 150 SaaS subscriptions. You start getting up into mid-sized companies, and it jumps up to 250 or like 350. And what's interesting is, and this is going to be hard to read, let me pause for a moment and say all of these slides will be distributed to you. I've got a bunch of data, so don't worry about squinting or jotting it down. Yeah, you'll get this full deck to be able to dig into later. But what you're actually seeing here is Xylo had showed over the past 4 years how spend on SaaS or the total number of SaaS products has changed. And for a while, it was going down. Not by a lot, but people were trying to consolidate and things we aren't using anymore, duplicates, spend was starting to shrink. And then last year, that trend started to reverse. Again, not by a lot, but by enough that you're like, okay, this is the world where we're somehow going to consolidate down just to 1 or 2 or 3 products. Doesn't seem like the world in which we're going to be living in here for a while. And what's interesting is, I showed that long tail graph of this wide variety, of head, torso, and tail specialist products. When we analyze the stacks of different companies, and we've been analyzing them, oh my goodness, for over the past 7 years, we've collected something like 1,500 tech stacks. One of the things we've seen is we look in the tech stacks and we see typically, year over year, about 17% of the products in people's stacks are from those head companies, another 33% from the torso, and these are sort of then the foundations around which people build their tech stacks. But then it's been pretty consistent for 7 years that almost all these tech stacks, about half of them, consist of these more specialized products as well, too. This consistency, I think, is a real testament to the value that people find in being able to augment these platforms with specialist technologies. Now, of course, the challenge is, all right, this is great in theory. There's a lot of things we can draw from. There's clearly uses for them. But how do we manage all of this? And for a number of years, the advice you would hear would be like, oh, well, you just need to consolidate. If you've got a whole bunch of these products, just consolidate it down into a fewer products. And don't get me wrong, that strategy isn't misguided. I mean, to the degree that you can eliminate products that you don't need, to the degree that you can consolidate, that's absolutely a valid strategy. But we've seen the data now, year over year over year, and consolidation alone isn't sufficient. And there's a pattern that has really started to emerge that I think is complementary to consolidation, that's aggregation. And these things sound very similar, but they're a little bit different. I tried to draw a simple diagram here because I just love sketching little things, as you'll see throughout this presentation. Consolidation is saying we've got a bunch of different things. Let's just reduce it down to a few. Aggregation is a little bit different. It's this notion of oh yeah, we've got a bunch of things, but instead of necessarily getting rid of all of them, what we're going to do is we're going to find some way to wrap around them, some sort of way to organize around them that makes it more manageable. It makes it easier for us to get value of them as a collection and not just a bunch of individual points. And so we're going to talk a lot here about aggregation because this really is the pattern that I believe helps make the Martech stack much more manageable. Now, to put this in context, I mean, we've been going through an evolution in this industry at many, many different levels. So I would say there was the first stage of Martech, more or less, let's say maybe starting in 2005, going up through 2015, 2020, somewhere in there. And this period of time, I know a number of you have been in this industry for a while, right? It was sort of, it was sort of defined by these dichotomies. All right, the classic one was, oh, you could either buy a suite or you could build best of breed. The suite was oh, well, you'll get everything within one box, but the downside is you're kind of limited to whatever is in that box. Best of breed, oh, wow, you could get pretty much anything you want, but good luck figuring out how to connect it all. Really, neither one of these was a particularly great choice. This is also the time when we used to have this really hard distinction between software and services. Are you a software company or are you a services company? And people would look at you strange if you somehow said, well, we're a little bit of both. No, that can't be. There's also, when many companies looked at this through the lens of, okay, are we going to build our own software for this, or are we going to buy software for it? And the problem is all of these things, while they sounded very, it's a simple choice, A or B, for many it's like, well, I kind of want a little bit of both. And that's really where we started to see this transition, that started around 2015, really got momentum, going over the next 5, 10 years, of what I call the second age of Martech, which was about breaking those dichotomies and starting to converge. So instead of suite versus best of breed, we started to see this emergence of platform ecosystems. Yes, you have these anchor platforms like Ibexa that are at the center of your stack, but then they're also open and they allow other specialist products to plug into them. More and more companies at Martech really started to lean into integration as a first-class feature set. We also started to see that, this blending between, you're not just a software company or a services company. Software is eating the world. Every service company is, to a certain degree, particularly in this industry, also a software company. Now how they choose to package that, how they choose to, maintain it. There's a wide variety of models, but people are blending these two business models very effectively. And then the same thing, the build versus buy is no longer really the right model, because you don't want to recreate the wheel, but you want to also be able to specialize for your particular business exactly how things run. And so we started to see really this model of saying, listen, we're going to buy the commoditized foundations. We're going to buy these platforms that, people have put a tremendous amount of architectural work, into having a stable foundation. And we're going to customize things on top of it. Now, getting a little ahead of myself, I actually think this moving from, X versus Y dichotomies to converging, we can have both X and Y. I think this is actually accelerating even more for a variety of reasons having to do with, more and more open data, a bunch of fun, wonderful things I know we'll be talking about today around AI, that even all these things between, commercial software and professional services and custom software are all getting more and more entangled into a composable canvas. Composable. All right, we're going to come back to that diagram in a second. You've probably been hearing the word composable a lot in the past few years, and you would not be wrong if you said, that sounds a little bit like a buzzword, and what exactly is this? This feels, kind of techy. Did people just make this up? And there's a lot of different ways things can be composable. We have this idea of, I would argue the Martech stack is itself an example of composability, right? You're bringing multiple different products together for some unified mission or set of capabilities. You then actually have platforms that are designed to help things compose together. And again, people talk about composable CDPs and composable DXPs, And in many ways, this is about this open platform concept really being taken to the furthest it can. And then, of course, and I know you know this, on the web side of things in particular, right? What are we doing with this technology? Well, we're very often bringing these things together to compose experiences and services for our customers. So composability is kind of happening at multiple layers. And composability is not new. Pretty much from the beginning of software, we've had composability. And this is one of these maps, again, you'd probably want to look at the slide offline, but, I'd looked at different composable examples, whether they were more service-oriented or data-oriented, whether they were more technical or non-technical. I just want to pick two examples on the extremes. Code libraries and cloud APIs. Pretty much every piece of software written in the past 40, 50 years has been composed. Programmers don't start from an absolute blank slate. They bring in frameworks, they bring in these libraries, they now call so many APIs through, clouds, the hyperscalers. Because again, why reinvent the wheel? You want to compose from these different capabilities and then build something unique on top of it. On the exact opposite extreme, I'm going to go so far as to say spreadsheets are an example of composability that every marketer, every business person is familiar with, right? What do? Well, you take different pieces of data, from different sources, you bring them together, you recombine them into something new. This is composability. Now, the thing that's really, and there's a bunch of examples all across, DXPs are phenomenal for composability, CDPs, and so forth. One of the most fascinating things that's happening right now, though, is AI at a number of different levels is making it easier to compose things. And so a lot of these different composable examples that lean a little bit more technical are increasingly becoming more accessible to less and less technical audiences. So let's talk a little bit more about very specific composability in the Martech stack. Like, why are people even doing this? And we did a survey last year of a couple hundred, marketing ops and marketing tech professionals, asking them about their stack and how they thought about composability. No surprise, people have a wide variety of different products in their Martech stack. Increasingly, they've gone to the place where, thanks to these vendors leaning into integrations and open platform architectures, they're getting integrated together. The majority of them are. But one of the things I found really interesting, and this goes back to that suite versus best of breed dichotomy, is I found that when people were bringing tools together in their stack, they sometimes had things that on the surface looked like a duplicate. Like, oh, well, don't you have this capability in this product? Why did you get this other product to also do that capability? Because you see this a lot. And I'm like, well, why is this? I mean, you did this intentionally? Not always intentionally, but a lot of times, yes. And so we asked people, why? And the 4 answers they gave us, some of which are quite counterintuitive. The first one was actually the one you expected, which is to say, like, yeah, maybe we had some sort of email capability in this product, but this other product that does email gave us more of the features we wanted, and so we used both of them together. About 2/3 said that was the case for, some of that overlap, some of that composition. Then things got interesting. Nearly 1/3 of them said, oh, well, we did that other product because it was actually more economical to do that. I'm like, wait a second, it was more economical for you to buy an additional product? Well, because, there's a number of these technologies where pricing is a function of things such as usage, capacity, in some cases tiers, number of users, all these different dimensions. And sometimes for a specialized capability, it actually ended up to be cheaper to get a specialist product to do that one thing. Another example was because they said, well, actually, it's a better user experience. And again, a little counterintuitive. You're like, wait, multiple products? How is that a better user experience? That's because for the particular team that needed a particular capability, having a tool that specialized in that actually did give them a better experience. And the same thing with governance. Again, you would assume, hey, wait, having more products in your stack, that's got to be worse for governance, not better. But then you realize, okay, well, sometimes having a product that can be a sandbox and you can isolate, who has access to it and what they're doing with it actually can facilitate better governance. So this is some of the rationale of why when people, even though there's consolidation happening, they still look to connect these things in a way that composes across multiple tools. And the last piece of data, again, this is sort of, yours as a takeaway, is we found that the more people did this, the more success they had on all 4 of those dimensions. Composability is a wild thing. All right, so I want to share something nerdy with you. I know this whole presentation's been really nerdy, but this may be the nerdiest part, so bear with me. There's something in tech, software that's been known as Conway's Law. And it was this idea that, it was an observation, that software tends to mirror the people who created it. Like if there's an organization that creates a piece of software, that software will sort of take on some of the characteristics of how that organization is structured and how they communicate and how they work. Actually kind of makes sense when you think about it. Now here's where things get interesting. In commercial software, there's a commercial software company that creates that product, and it does represent the way they think of the world. But then when they package it up as an app, and then they sell it to someone, for a long time we've been in a world where then the company that adopts it, okay, they actually have to now change the way their company operates and the way their company thinks to start to match the way the software from that other company thought the world should be. Now, I'm not saying that's always a bad thing, particularly as we're in a mode where we're learning new things, we're changing capabilities. Maybe actually learning from that company that created it is a good thing. But as we get better and better at this, we start to realize hey, wait a second, my business is a little bit different than that business, and I want to have my own way of looking at this. And this is the exciting thing about this composability and this openness, is we're increasingly saying, okay, as an organization that gets this software, you don't just have to mirror the way the folks who originally created that software think. You can use that as a foundation in which, okay, we start to configure it, we customize it, maybe we start to compose multiple apps together. This is really where we find ourselves in this increasingly convergence around composable canvas. And the reason I highlight the professional services side of it is because this is a new way of thinking. This is a new way of building digital operations. And so companies are going through a maturity development of how to do it. And it's one of the reasons why I'm a very big believer in the power of services companies, particularly at this moment in time, because they develop the experience of seeing this across multiple clients and are able to propagate that experience, across others. It is really one of the best ways for folks to accelerate. So I do think we are in a golden age for services companies in this space. But part of what I would also push the services companies is ultimately we need to empower every single brand, every single company to be in the position that they have more and more of the capability to continuously adapt how they use that software, even on a, week by week, month by month basis as new opportunities come up. Now, a few minutes left, I want to just shift perspective a little bit. Because I've tried to give you a vision of okay, these aggregation platforms, at the center of stacks, they allow you to very easily start to compose things together so you can really create a digital operations, digital experiences that reflect your unique business. There's kind of a meta concept here about the possibility of how companies in the Martech space can organize themselves. Now, there's generally been two models in which we've seen companies consolidate in the Martech space. One is to consolidate as a suite. There are companies, Salesforce is sort of like the classic, one where they've gone out, they've acquired a bunch of companies, and they've really tried to subsume them into that suite. There's pros to that, there's cons to that, but that's sort of one model. But, again, sort of the individual components, over time, they sort of lose their identity to that, and things kind of, mesh into the middle. On the exact opposite end of the spectrum, we've had, sort of the classic private equity companies, where they're okay, so there's a bunch of these different, specialist companies. We will aggregate them together, because this gives us a certain scale from a financial perspective, but the pieces are really kept individual. Again, there's pros and cons to that model as well, too. But there's a new model that really reflects this same thing we've been talking about, aggregation more than just consolidation, where this idea of companies that, okay, they're acquiring multiple companies together, but they're not just meshing them into one big blob. They are trying to keep the individual identities of the specialist tools, but at the same time, they're not trying to keep them worlds apart. They're really looking at how do we provide some of these aggregation wrappers around this, And so as they acquire a set of companies to cover a portfolio of capabilities in Martech, they want what the strengths and the unique identity of each one of those products to continue to retain its value, to continue to retain that entrepreneurial identity and commitment to their customers. But they also want to start to say, like, okay, but we do want these things to work together. How do we have certain technical foundations, facilitating the integrations, the governance? And then also at the business level, there's opportunities to say, like, okay, there are ways, we can make it easier for customers and partners to be able to pull things from across that portfolio. And as you probably have surmised here, one of the reasons I've been talking to Ibexa and the quantum group so much over these past few months is this is very much the model that quantum is pioneering. I'm seeing this in some other places too, and I think it's fascinating that we're going to have this opportunity to, well, just like we went from the suite versus best of breed to, hey, can we have these platform ecosystems that are really the best of both worlds? Can we have that same thing with these Martech portfolio companies that they're sort of taking the best of the, cohesions of suite, and the best of the individual identity and entrepreneurships, of portfolios, and bringing those together in an aggregation. So I suspect you will hear more about that, here from the Ibexa and Quantum team. The last thing I want to leave you with is because, I don't know, was this a lot to hit you with like first thing in the morning? I apologize. It's an exciting time wherein there's a lot happening, but it's not easy. There's a lot of concepts that we're adapting to. And I sort of want to put this in context that if you're feeling like, wow, this is a lot to absorb, you are not alone. This is the phenomenon of everyone in this day and age. And I drew this thing on a napkin, 15 years or so ago. I called it Martech's Law because I saw it with marketing technologists. We're in this mode where technology is changing exponentially. Right? I mean, Moore's Law is sort of the foundation of that, the doubling of computing power every couple of years or so. But we've seen this on so many other different dimensions. I'm sure you've been following some of the things with AI and LLM frontier models. They've been in an exponential growth curve here. The problem is, as again, any of you running businesses or advising clients know, organizations do not change exponentially. I would say, more or less, we change logarithmically. Change is hard. And then when you juxtapose these two things, well, that sort of feeling you have in the pit of your stomach that, oh my God, how do you figure this all out? This is it. It's like having, 1 foot on the dock and, 1 foot on the ferry as it's going away. I would say this is actually the quintessential management problem of the 21st century. And I have yet to meet a company that is not struggling with this. And oh my goodness, AI is absolutely accelerating that. So I want to end this on a positive note. Like if I just ended it now, you'd be like, wow, thanks for that, Scott. I feel better. When does the bar open? There are ways to deal with this. But it's important to note there's not a silver bullet. There's not one sort of magical thing that is going to just, oh, yeah, okay, now we can all change exponentially. We're good. What there is are two core strategies that really do make a difference. One is you have to be strategic about which changes to embrace. There are just too many things changing in parallel simultaneously to address all of them. And one of the problems I see companies make again and again is they're trying to take on too many of them at once. You have to be really thoughtful about which changes are most relevant to our business and customers, and let's really lean onto those and be okay with the fact that some of these other changes we're not going to get to right now. The second thing is becoming a more agile organization. The one capability I think is more important than anything else at this point is this adaptability. And that's at so many levels. It's about designing your tech stack in a way that's open platforms so that you can continuously and more easily adapt it by adding, removing, customizing things. But it's also from a management model. Like how do we develop a workforce in a way in a processes of managing our teams that is really facilitating them, continuously learning, and continuously be willing to change and adapt how we get things done. This is hard. This is not easy. But here's the thing. You take these two things together. If you're able to be really strategic about which changes you're embracing, and you're able to be more agile in how you operate your business, You're still not going to get to the place where, okay, now we're all changing exponentially. But it isn't a game about changing exponentially. The game is about doing this better than your competition. And if you're more strategic on the changes, if you're just even a little more agile than the competition, you can outrun them. And that really, at the end of the day, is the way in which we win in what is a very exciting, wonderful, but sometimes overwhelming world in which all of this is changing. Martech isn't slowing down. It's an ecosystem world. Aggregation can be more powerful than consolidation. Composability is such a great way to now let you and your clients craft more tailored solutions. And the opportunity, I mean, it is huge. It is, for all of the challenges, an absolutely wonderful time to be working in marketing and digital technology. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Scott.